The Prisoner, Book 17. It was the middle of the night in the Glen Macfuzz. Thick storm clouds were stretching across the sky like a black cloak. Soon they had shut out all the rays of light from the moon and stars. The night was as black as coal. Up in the hills, a barn owl sat on the stump of an old oak tree. It sat there every night and looked down into the glen for something to eat. Tonight it was having a hard job. Its big round eyes were struggling to see through the sooty blackness, but it was no good. There was not enough light to see by. Blinking its eyes, the owl sat and waited for things to get better. After a long time, a cool north wind came gusting across the treetops. The clouds parted quickly and soon began to drift away. The moon came out and the sky was lit up by the twinkle of 1,000 stars. The Glen Macfuzz was as bright as day. At the top of the hill, the owl sat up with a jerk. Its keen eyes had spotted something. Way down at the bottom of the hill, a dark form was shuffling around. Was it a rabbit or a fox? No, it was some sort of animal that the owl had never seen before. Shifting from one foot to the other, the owl hooted softly. Stretching out its neck to get a better look, the owl looked down again. The horrible thing was creeping up the hill. With a loud screech, the owl took off. The owl was eager to get away and hide somewhere as quickly as possible. The thing down in the glen had given it a very nasty fright. The snagron did not see the owl. She slid quickly up the hill. This was not easy, because the limp body of little Don was hanging down from her powerful mouth. He was still in his nightgown, and when the snagron had caught him, he had fainted. It looked as if she was carrying a bundle of rags, which were trailing down from each side of her mouth. The snagron intended to carry him off to the Glen of Gloom. She was in a hurry. She wanted to reach the border of her glen before daylight. By the time she came to the crooked pathway which led down to her glen, she was worn out, but she did not stop for a rest. Without waiting for a second, she slid down the footpath. Soon she was passing through the thorny bushes which stopped unwelcome visitors from entering her land. She did not stop until she came to her cave. Now she knew that nothing could disturb her. She went into the cave and let Don's body drop into the darkest corner. Turning quickly, she slid back towards the green pool. Arching her neck, she looked very hard at the twisted tree which stood next to the cave. Her eyes began to sparkle and flash. A soft, murmuring sound came from her mouth. Her head began to sway back and forth, back and forth. Her long red tongue came flicking in and out, in and out. The murmuring sound got louder. She seemed to be singing to the twisted tree. This singing came from deep down in her throat and floated across the glen. The twisted tree was beginning to tremble. Its branches began to sway. Creaking and groaning, the thick brown bark on its trunk began to bend and crack. The snagron was weaving a powerful spell around the tree. The singing stopped. The snagron started to growl, softly at first, and then louder and louder. Soon the Glen of Gloom was ringing with the horrible sound. Raising her head, the snagron's eyes began to flicker. For a short time, everything was still. The Snagron seemed to be getting herself ready for something. Then it started. Dazzling flashes of blue and orange light came shooting out of her eyes. Suddenly, the tree seemed to be burning. It was surrounded by flickering orange and blue lights, which were reaching up to the sky. It was a fantastic display. Then, just as suddenly, the lights went out. Now, the twisted branches of the tree began to uncurl. Lurching and creaking, these branches began to creep towards the mouth of the cave. Each branch looked like an ugly brown arm. The twigs on the end of each branch looked like sharp, skinny fingers. With little scratching sounds, they crept across the hard rock. By now, the first branch was stretching across the mouth of the cave. This branch stopped. The second branch began to curl around the first branch. Then it stopped. This went on and on until all the branches were stretching across the cave. All that could be seen was a tangle of bent and curling branches. The mouth of the cave was just about invisible, and Dawn was shut inside. The branches were as solid as the steel bars of a prison. Nothing could get in, and nothing could get out. The Snagron had used her powers to turn the cave into a jail. Now Dawn would never get away. The Snagron stopped growling. She felt very pleased with herself. Her trick had worked. She had caught one of the clan, and soon she would get the rest of them. Then she would teach them a lesson they would never forget. She would make them pay for straying into her glen. Soon they would wish they had never set eyes on her. Feeling very contented, she slid down to the banks of the green pool. She took a long drink from its filthy green water. After all the effort of carrying Dawn over the hills, she was worn out and drowsy. She lay down next to the pool. She wound her long body round and round and quickly fell asleep. Soon she was snoring. Back in the darkness of the cave, Dawn lay as still as a rock. He was hardly breathing. Then, far away, a fox began to howl. Dawn's eyelids started to flutter, and a soft moan came from his lips. He was coming round at last. He sat up and shook his head. He looked around in puzzlement. All he could see was the gleam of moonbeams on the wall of the cave.
"Where's my bedroom?" he asked. "Where am I? What have I done?"
His brain was in a muddle. He seemed to have lost his memory. He had forgotten all about the Snagron. He looked down and saw his torn nightgown.
"Am I dreaming?"
he asked himself. He got onto his feet and went across to the tangle of branches. The Glen of Gloom was lit up by bright moonlight. He looked in dismay at the towering cliffs and mountains which surrounded him. With a gasp of astonishment, he saw the Snagron sleeping soundly on the banks of the green pool. Suddenly, he was very afraid. His throat felt as dry as dust. He tried to speak, but only a croaking sound would come out of his mouth. The blood pounded round his body. His head was burning hot. Spots seemed to float before his eyes. There was a pain in his side where the snagron's curving teeth had bitten into him. He felt weak and feeble. Now he sat down so that he wouldn't feel faint again. Now he was able to remember everything. The snagron had made a fool of him. Why hadn't he used his brains? He was caught like an animal in a trap. He was the snagron's prisoner. Then little Don saw red. He shook with anger. Hurling himself at the branches, he began to beat and kick them with all his power. But it was no good. The branches were far too thick. They would not give way. Aiming a last kick against them, Don sat down on the ground. There didn't seem to be any way of bursting out. He was trying hard not to cry, but it took a lot of effort. With a deep groan, he held his head in his hands. He knew he would never get away. He sat there for a long, long time. When he looked up at last, some thin beams of daylight were lighting up the cave. These were the first rays of the morning sun. Now Don could see more. The cave went back a long way until it was lost in the murky darkness.
"It must go deep underground,"
he said aloud.
"Yes, it does indeed,"
said the snagron.
"It goes deep, deep down."
Don nearly fainted. The snagron had come sneaking up to the mouth of the cave.
"Pardon me," she said sweetly. "Did I startle you?"
Now her glittering eyes were looking in at him.
"Welcome to the Glen of Gloom," she went on. "I'm so glad you could come to pay me a visit. Perhaps the rest of the clan will come looking for you. We may end up with a crowd of you. Yes, yes, I would like that."
Don could hardly stand it. He felt dizzy. Freezing shivers ran up and down his back. The snagron seemed to tower above him.
"I won't hurt you, my boy," she hissed. "I'm the queen of this glen, but I won't harm you at all."
Don ran across to her.
"Please say that you'll let me go.
He blurted out.
I'll never come back again. I won't bother you ever again. Please say you'll allow me to go."
The snagron pretended to think about this. It made her happy to keep tormenting him.
"I'm sorry," she said at last. "I can't let you go. Anyway, this silly tree is blocking the doorway. If you are thinking about leaving, you can't get out this way. You'll have to go the other way."
Don was not quick-witted enough to see that the snagron was playing a trick on him.
"Which way shall I go?"
he asked eagerly.
"You can go the back way," she said. "It's a sort of shortcut, a quick way out. It's very simple and easy. Try it and see. And when you get back, tell your chief to make sure that the rest of your clan stay away from here."
Don didn't want to wait around, so he didn't stop to think.
"Thank you very much,"
she said.
"Can I go now?"
"By all means,"
said the crafty snagron.
"Off you go, my boy."
But If Don had seen the crafty gleam in the Snagron's eyes as he started off, he would never have gone.
He will soon turn round and come running back again,
she said scornfully, with a swish of her tail. At first, Don found that it was easy to see where he was going. The front part of the cave was very big, and the roof was way above Don's head. But he had to keep a sharp lookout to make sure that he didn't hurt himself. Here and there he had to step round heaps of sharp rocks and mounds of rubble. Looking down, he could see that the ground was made up of slippery yellow clay. Now and again he saw slugs and snails creeping along, leaving sticky silver trails on the ground. As he got further in, he could see one or two clumps of toadstools sprouting up from the clay. Dusty cobwebs were hanging down from the roof. It began to feel creepy. Now he could hear a faint gurgling sound. Looking around, he could see that little streams of liquid were running down the walls of the cave. This liquid was a greenish color, like the water from the pool. It left a slippery green coating on the rocky walls. The liquid ran onto the ground, forming small green pools and puddles.
That explains the green pool,
said Don to himself. Somehow this liquid must drain away and keep filling the pool up. The further in that Don went, the wetter it became. Showers of green rain came dripping down from the roof. The water was streaming down the walls and onto the ground. The yellow clay had become thick, squishy mud. Soon Don was soaking wet, but he kept going. Things were getting darker now, and the cave was getting smaller. The roof slanted down steeply, and the walls were coming in too. Don had to bow his head and crouch down so that he would not bump himself. This part of the cave was more like a tunnel. The rock was very smooth, and in some parts Don had to turn sideways in order to get past. But at least it was dry now. All the water seemed to have gone. But it was so dark that Don could hardly see. He had to strain his eyes and squint to see where he was going. It felt very spooky, and it was getting darker and darker. If only he had a candle or a torch to light his way. He put one hand out in front of him and tried to feel his way along. Now a horrible foul smell drifted towards him. It made him feel queasy and sick. He put his other hand over his mouth and kept going. It was much cooler now, and he began to shiver with the cold. He went a bit quicker, praying that he would not trip over anything. Suddenly he stopped. Something was rubbing against his ankle. A freezing shiver went quivering up his back. He was too frightened to look down. Hardly breathing, he stood as still as he could. At long last, the rubbing stopped. Then something darted off into the darkness. Turning round, Don was just in time to see a small, dark animal squeezing into a crack in the wall.
What was that?
He asked himself. A cockroach? A big black beetle? A harmless frog? An ugly toad? A stray rat? Or some sort of beast that no one had ever seen before? How many other horrible things were lurking and prowling around in the darkness? Don stood there for a long, long time. He was freezing cold. If only he had a thick coat and some boots to put on. His nightgown was far too thin to keep the cold out, and anyway it was wet through, but it was no good moaning about it. He had to keep going. Shivering and sneezing, he began to creep forward again. Before long, everything was pitch black. He began to be afraid that he was lost. Looking for a way out of this cave was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He didn't know how long he had been roaming about down here. Was it only yesterday that the Snagron had caught him? It felt as if he had been down there for years. Perhaps he would never get out and would have to roam about in the darkness forever. He began to cry. Then, at last, a long, long way in front of him, he saw a faint yellow light. Praying that this was the exit, Don began to run. The light got brighter and brighter as he ran towards it. Suddenly, his foot hit something hard and solid. Before he could stop himself, he went hurtling down to the ground. Rubbing his head, he sat up. Thank goodness he was unhurt. The light was still very dim, but he could see that he was in a big, rocky room. At the far end of the room, he saw the dark archway of yet another tunnel, boring deeper into the rock. Far above his head, he could see a very small gap in the roof. This let in a single ray of daylight. But the gap was far, far up, and Don could see that it was impossible to get out that way. Just then he felt something sharp digging into his hand. Looking down, he went as white as a sheet. His hand was resting on a skull. Drawing back in horror and just stopping himself from screaming, Don saw that the room was crowded with skeletons. It was incredible. There were loads of them. There were far too many to count, but there must have been at least 1,000. Some of them were hanging from rusty chains. Some of them were so old that they were ready to crumble away into powder. The bones had come from all sorts of different animals. There were the legs of frogs and feet of toads, ribs of rabbits and tails of squirrels, skulls of stoats and backbones of weasels, beaks of owls and wings of eagles, horns of goats and antlers of stags, teeth of sheep and legs of horses, skulls of cows and the arms, ribs and fingers of men. There was a mountain of skulls full of grinning yellow teeth. Don felt sure that he was going to pass out. He didn't feel any better when he saw that the walls of the room were coated with big red and purple marks. Red paint? No, blood stains. This must be where the Snagron came to eat each of her victims. She must have had some horrible banquets down here. She was nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer. Don let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound went round and round, getting louder and louder. Don felt that he was going mad. He stood up in a shower of dust. Which way should he run? Suddenly, a horrible howling sound came from the archway at the other side of the room. It sounded terrible, like the wailing of 1,000 bagpipes. Don stood rooted to the spot. His legs began to buckle, but he could not drag his eyes away from the archway. Then, with a loud rattle of wings, thousands and thousands of squealing, squeaking bats burst into the room. All that Don could see was the blur of their black wings. All that he could hear were their squeals, squeaks, and screeches. Swooping and darting, the bats were everywhere. Don was quivering like a jelly. He wanted to scream, but his throat was too dry. All he could do was croak and gurgle. More and more bats came crowding into the room. The strain was too much for him. Turning quickly, he ran. With terror spurring him on, he speeded back the way he had come, as fast as his legs would carry him. Shouting and screaming, he did not stop until he came to the mouth of the cave. He went hurtling into a tangle of branches and began to pound and kick them with all his power.
Ah! Help! Help! Let me out!
He shouted.
I can't stand it anymore. I must get out somehow. Please let me out. Please set me free.
Who's there?
Called out the Snagron.
Who is kicking up all this row?
Her bright, beady eyes looked in at him.
There's no need to burst a blood vessel,
she went on.
Just cool down a bit.
Don stopped shouting. With a swish of her tail, the Snagron said,
I'm so glad to see you again. Why did you come back so soon? Did you get lost, you silly clown? You're not very smart, are you? Or did you come back to play with me? How sweet of you. What a good boy you are.
The Snagron was purring like a cat.
You silly little upstart,
she gloated.
Did you think you could get away? Well, now you should know better. I have never forgiven your clan for snooping around in my glen. It is forbidden. It is out of bounds. And no one can come here without paying for it. So now I must punish you all.
Don sank sadly down to the ground. He had given up the struggle. He was powerless against the Snagron, and it was time to quit. He had had enough. She had beaten him. Seeing this, the Snagron was happier than ever. She began to boast.
Now then, she said, let me explain the main parts of my plan to you. You are very important because you are my bait. The others will come looking for you, and I will trap them all. So you see, all we have to do is wait for them to come. How clever I am. My plan cannot fail, and when I've caught you all, it will be time to settle our account.
The Snagron was very proud of herself. She was sure that her plan would work. She looked down at little Don.
In the meantime, you will live here with me. You will become my servant. I will have a holiday, and you will do all the work. You will wait on me hand and foot and do exactly as I ask. And there'll be no complaining. There'll be no moans, groans, or grumbles. I'm sure you'll love it, won't you? Won't you love staying here? Come on then, answer me.
But the Snagron had gone too far. Don was angry again. Jumping to his feet, he shook his fist at her.
You big ugly monster!
He shouted.
I wouldn't work for you if you were the last person living. You are a mean, murdering, cowardly, brainless killer. You are a cutthroat.
Now it was the Snagron's turn to be angry. Her eyes were flashing and sparkling. Her head was swaying from side to side. She was foaming at the mouth. Snarling and growling, she spat out these words.
You're going to be very sorry you said that. When I've caught all the others, you'll be the first one I start on. I'll build a tower to keep you in, and I'll keep you for so long that you'll forget your name. And then, when I'm in a more playful mood, I shall dream up lots of painful ways of hurting you. Maybe I'll chain you up. Maybe I'll dangle you over hot coal. Maybe I'll pickle your brain and keep it in a glass jar. I'll teach you to meddle. I'll make you wish you'd never been born. And then, in the end, you'll make a lovely, dainty morsel for me to eat.
And without saying another word, she slid back down to the green pool and got ready to go to sleep. Crouching in a corner, Don held his head in his hands. How long would the Snagron keep him here? Would it be days or weeks? He could be stuck here for years. Would she murder him? Or would he end up as her next meal? And if he was going to be her servant, what horrible jobs would she make him do? He had a nasty feeling that it would not be too long before he found out. Bowing his head, Don tried in vain to get some sleep. Read these questions and then write your answers neatly. Do not forget where to put capital letters and full stops. Question 1. What sort of owl was sitting on the tree stump? Question 2. How did the Snagron make sure that Don could not get out of the cave? Question 3. What colour was the liquid that ran down the cave walls? Question 4. What 5 things did Don think may have been rubbing against his ankle? Draw one of them. Question 5. Why did Don feel cold? Question 6. What was in the rocky room? Question 7. Draw the bats attacking Don. Question 8. The Snagron says that Don is her bait. What does this mean? Question 9. What does the Snagron intend to do with Don in the end? Question 10. Draw the bit of the story that you like best.